Why do the United States and China seem to disagree on almost everything? Whether it's trade, technology, or global politics, the relationship between these two superpowers seem to be getting more complicated every year. But according to former Singapore Foreign Minister George Yeo, the real reason behind their rivalry isn't just about politics. He says it's about something much deeper: history, culture, and economics. And understanding these differences could help us better understand where the world is heading in the years ahead. Let's take a look at what George Yeo had to say.
The problem is this. The US believes that China will behave like an imperial power when it becomes big or bigger. Now, China's per capita GDP is about 20% of the US today. Now, it's not inconceivable that the per capita income in China reaches half that of the US, because the Chinese are hardworking people, strong families, high savers, passionate about education. If China achieves half the per capita of the US, China's GDP will be that of the US and the EU combined. Now, if you're in business, we say, oh, yeah, this is very important information, because it means that wherever you are, your biggest market, your biggest threat, your biggest opportunity will be China. And if that's the case, you better make sure that all your key people understand China. If not for offensive purposes, at least for defensive purposes. And it is on the cards. We may be, let's say, by 2050, 2060, 2070, we can be out by 10, 20 years. But without nuclear war, it's unstoppable. So this is the future we're talking about. And by 2050, given demographic trends, 30% of the world's population will be African, 40% Muslim, and by 2050, maybe 1 in 2 babies will be Muslim. So it is into that world that we've got to see the future and the relations among the great powers. China does not want to take on the US as global hegemon, not because they can't, but they think it is foolish. They think that to attempt to do it will lead to your own self-destruction. And they have ample examples in their own history that when they started interfering in the affairs of others, it will in the end boomerang back on them. The idea that American fleets should be in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, in the South China Sea, in the Sea of Okhotsk, wherever, they think, well, you can do that because you have the capability, but it costs you a fortune. And you can only do it now because you have the US dollar and the exorbitant privilege which comes to the US dollar. Now, we remember in the 60s, the Vietnam War, which was very expensive. And Johnson wanted to carry on with the Great Society program. So in the end, the US dollar had to be depegged from gold, and it led to horrifying inflation, which Paul Volcker later had to squeeze out at horrible pain to the entire world. They don't want to do that. In fact, in my view, they will never open the domestic capital market fully to London and New York, because you do that, you lose control of monetary policy within the country. And China have always disbelieved that to preserve its homogeneity, and it's 92% Han, to preserve its homogeneity, you must always build walls around yourself. It can be a physical wall, it can be a capital markets wall, it can be a wall on Hollywood movies, on textbooks, and the most remarkable wall of all in recent years, a biological wall that they built. You know, in the national anthem, which they sing every day, they talk about rebuilding walls. The Americans don't know this. They think that, like themselves, the Chinese are also a proselytizing missionary power. The Americans, when they come to Asia, sometimes it's cynical, but usually it's sincere. Their wish is for you to become like them. And they kept lecturing Lee Kuan Yew. He got so exasperated. So he said, make me a 51st state, and I'll follow your instructions. Then you look after me, you look after my defense.
One of the most interesting points George Yeo makes is that many people are looking at China the wrong way. Instead of asking where China is going, they only look at where China is today. For example, China's average income per person is still much lower than America's. In fact, it's only about 20% of the US level. So when people see that number, they often conclude that China is still far behind, or even that its rise is slowing down. But Jojo says that misses the bigger picture. According to him, unless something extremely serious happens, like a major war or another national crisis, China's long-term growth is likely to continue. Why? Because China's growth isn't just driven by government policies, it's driven by the people. For decades, Chinese families have placed a huge emphasis on education. Parents work incredibly hard to give their children a better future. Families also save a large part of their income instead of spending everything they earn. That creates more money for investment and future growth. On top of that, China has a culture that values hard work, discipline, and planning for the long term. When you put all these things together, George Yeo believes China still has plenty of room to grow. In fact, he believes that sometime between 2050 and 2070, China's average income could reach about half that of the United States. Now, at first, that may not sound very impressive. You might be thinking, if China only reaches half of America's income, then America would still be much richer, isn't it? But here's where things become really interesting. You see, China has over 1.4 billion people, and the United States has only around 340 million. So even if the average Chinese citizen produces only half as much as the average American, China's overall economy would become enormous simply because it has so many more people. Joshua says that at that point, China's total economy could be as large as the US and EU combined. Just think about that for a moment. This isn't really about politics. It's about simple mathematics. And that's why businesses, investors, and governments around the world are paying so much attention to China. Whether they like China or not, they can't afford to ignore a market of that size. If China's economy continues growing over the next few decades, every major country will eventually have to find a way to deal with it. But this also raises an important question. If China's rise is driven by these long-term trends, why has the relationship between China and the US become so tense? According to Joshua, the answer has a lot to do with how the two countries see the world very differently. Many people in Washington believe that as China becomes more powerful, it will naturally try to replace the US as the world's leading superpower. After all, that's what many great powers have tried to do throughout history, right? But Joshua argues that China doesn't necessarily think that way. He believes China's view of the world has been shaped by thousands of years of history. America is a relatively young country. Since its founding, it has often believed that its political and economic system is something other countries should follow. Whether through diplomacy, alliances, or international organizations, the US has spent decades promoting its ideas around the world. Joshua described this as a missionary mindset. China, on the other hand, has a very different way of thinking. For most of its history, China wasn't interested in spreading its political system to other countries. Instead, its main goal was to keep the country stable and secure. Now, Joshua calls this a fortress mentality. In other words, China is more focused on protecting itself than trying to reshape the rest of the world. Once you understand this idea, many of China's policies start to make more sense. Take the Great Firewall, for example. Many people in the West see it simply as internet censorship. China sees it as a way to protect its own digital space. The same idea applies to its capital controls. Many Western economists argue that China should allow money to move freely in and out of the country. But Beijing believes those restrictions help protect its economy from financial shocks and give the government greater control during times of crisis. The same thinking can also be seen in China's restrictions on certain foreign media, education, and industries. Whether you agree with these policies or not isn't the point. George Shio's point is that they all follow the same pattern. China isn't trying to remove the walls around its system, it's trying to strengthen them. And this difference in thinking is one reason why the United States and China often misunderstand each other. One side is focused on maintaining its global leadership, the other is focused on protecting its own stability. This also helps explain another important issue: money, more specifically, the global financial system. You see, for decades, the US dollar has been the world's main reserve currency. Countries use it for international trade, central banks hold it as reserves, and investors around the world rely on it. Because of that, the US has been able to borrow money and run large budget deficits much more easily than most countries. But Joshua says history shows that this advantage doesn't last forever. He points to the Vietnam War as an example. The enormous cost of the war, combined with heavy government spending at home, put huge pressure on the US financial system. Eventually, the US abandoned the gold standard in 1971, changing the global monetary system forever. China has paid close attention to that history. Beijing believes that maintaining control over its financial system is a key part of protecting its sovereignty. That's one reason China has been cautious about fully opening its financial market. If foreign money can move in and out of a country without restrictions, it becomes much harder for the government to manage its own economy. Critics say this makes China's financial system less efficient. Supporters argue it makes the system more stable. Joshua believes China sees these controls as a strategic choice, not a weakness. Because once a country loses control over its financial system, it also loses some control over its future. When you put all of these together, a very different picture begins to emerge. Now, the competition between China and the US isn't simply about who has the bigger economy or the stronger military. It's about two countries with very different history, different priorities, and different ways of seeing the world. Whether you agree with Joshua's analysis or not, it helps explain why the relationship between Washington and Beijing has become so complicated. The disagreements we see today aren't only about trade, technology, or military power. They are also about history, they are also about culture, and they are also about two very different visions of how the world should work. So, what do you think? Do you agree with Joshua? Or do you think the rivalry between China and the United States is driven by something else? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more videos on geopolitics and global affairs. Thank you for watching.